Ole Miss should absolutely be over Alabama, South Carolina, and Miami in the playoff rankings, but will they?
You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the Locked On Ole Miss Podcast, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hello, I'm Steven Willis, a 10-year veteran member of the national media and a former Ole Miss staff member as well. On today's show, we're breaking down the college football playoff race after the regular season has concluded. What we learned is that this playoff will feature 11 teams that absolutely deserve to be there. But for that final spot, we're looking at 4 extremely flawed teams: Alabama, South Carolina, Ole Miss, and Miami, all battling it out for that last spot. So let's be real. Ole Miss should claim that spot when all is said and done, but we're dealing with humans here, and that adds a lot of unpredictability, and we'll talk about all of that stuff. Stick around for a full breakdown. Locked On Ole Miss has you covered. We're free and available on all the podcast apps and on YouTube. Thank you for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen every day, and a special hello to the insiders and everydayers who make the show what it is. Don't forget to find a second listen on the network. Chris Gordy at Locked On SEC or Corey Burton at Locked On Vandy. They provide great perspectives on college football, the SEC, and yes, even Ole Miss, so check them out. You can start this season off with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So we are going to attempt to have a nuanced conversation about Ole Miss and the playoffs. And everybody needs to understand before we go in this. I realize that Kentucky happened. I realize that Florida happened. But that is not really relevant to this conversation that we find ourselves in at the moment. If Ole Miss would have beat Kentucky and Florida, they would have been in the playoff. They'd have beat both of them. They'd have been hosting a playoff game and playing in the SEC title game against Texas on Saturday. But they didn't. So they put themselves in this situation. They did to themselves to allow a beauty contest to happen to where the logos of Miami and Alabama on the helmet are in the same competition with them. They allowed that to happen. But when you look at the 4 teams battling for one spot, because that is kind of what is happening in this playoff race so far, it is Miami, Alabama, South Carolina, and Ole Miss fighting for one playoff spot. And Ole Miss absolutely is the best of those 4 teams. Now, they don't have the prettiest logo. They don't have the cachet of a lot of the teams in this competition. But as far as the best out of those 4 teams, I don't know that you can argue that it's not Ole Miss. Let's start with the easy one. Against South Carolina, Ole Miss went to South Carolina Stadium and beat them by 24 points. And let's be clear, if they would have played that game for 8 quarters, South Carolina would not have scored a touchdown in that game. It was an absolutely dominating performance. South Carolina cannot jump Ole Miss in good faith, and they certainly can't jump Alabama, who they lost to the next week. So South Carolina lost to both of the teams they're competing with in this conversation. Now, I understand that there's going to be people in the room, committee members deciding what's going on and everything, and it could get weird and unpredictable and all of that stuff. But if you just look at common sense, South Carolina is not jumping 2 teams that beat them with the same record as them. So South Carolina getting in, even though they're a 21% playoff predictor, All-State, at the moment, does not seem likely. So that leaves Ole Miss, Alabama, and Miami. And it gets far more subjective whenever you deal with this. You have Ole Miss and Alabama that have wins over Georgia and South Carolina as 2 of their better wins. Alabama has the Missouri win, so them randomly hanging into the rankings for nothing nefarious at all is at least interesting, but that is counting another ranked win for the Alabama Crimson Tide. Ole Miss beat Georgia worse than Alabama did. Alabama almost surrendered a 30-point lead at home in that Alabama-Georgia game. We all remember. We all watched what happened there. Alabama almost surrendered that league. Alabama then barely beat South Carolina in a game where the offensive coordinator didn't have a shocker at the end of the game and let Lenore Sellers throw the ball downfield, they'd have probably beat Alabama that game too. They beat South Carolina by 2 at home. They beat Georgia by, I think, 7 or something like that at home. It was a one-score game at home. Ole Miss beat Georgia 28-10 at home later in the season when Georgia started to figure it out a little bit. They beat South Carolina 27-3 on South Carolina's home field. The head-to-head conversation is very much slanted on the Ole Miss side, but Alabama fans are going to say, but LSU. And you're right, you did beat LSU, but Ole Miss fans can go, but Oklahoma. And then at Vandy game's a wash. So the resume-wise, it's exactly the same with Ole Miss leading in every single metric to make Ole Miss a better team. The difference might be the strength of schedule is at 16 as opposed to 31. That little bit of a gap. Ole Miss has a better team this year than Alabama. And if it wasn't for the logo on the side of the helmet, it would be no question that Ole Miss was in Alabama's position. Miami dropping down. How will they drop Miami after the loss to Syracuse on the road to go to a 2-loss ACC team? How far will Miami fall? Will they fall below Ole Miss? There's a lot of subjective human interaction stuff that is working very much against the Ole Miss Rebels right now. Again, I talked about this at the beginning of this segment. Ole Miss lost to Kentucky. Ole Miss lost to Florida. If they'd have won those games, they would be in Atlanta, they'd be hosting, and all of this would be done and dusted. This was the best Ole Miss team ever, potentially the best roster in the entire country. And it just didn't happen. But the argument that we have are these 4 teams. That is what the playoff committee has done, has put these 4 teams together. And where does Ole Miss rank in these 4 teams? On a neutral field, would you take Ole Miss against Alabama, against South Carolina, or against Miami? And I think Ole Miss would beat all 3 of those. And Ole Miss has beaten one by 4 scores on their home field. Listen, Ole Miss, Alabama, South Carolina, and Miami, none of them deserve to make the playoffs. But one of them will make the playoffs. And that is the conversation that we're having. Resume-wise, between those 4 teams, Ole Miss is by far superior. Ole Miss has a 3% chance of making the college football playoff, according to the All-State Playoff Predictor. South Carolina, 21%. Miami, 24%. Alabama, 30%. Ask Florida State what happens when you get into a beauty contest with the Alabama Crimson Tide, when it becomes a popularity contest, when you are relying on people to actually be honest of what's going on. You do not want to be in a contest with the Alabama Crimson Tide because they will win every single time. And also, let's be real about something, okay? The playoff committee is headed over by a Big Ten person. And right now, no team scares everybody like Ole Miss in the playoff rankings. None. There is nobody out there that can come in as a 12 seed and win the thing, that can pull a New York Giants like the Ole Miss Rebels. All Ole Miss has to do is get hot, get the correct matchup, and all of a sudden they can run. And next thing is like number 12 seed Ole Miss. For some reason, they're in the semifinals. That is absolutely possible. And we saw this weekend also in the Michigan-Ohio State game. The entire narrative surrounding college football this year was based on the fact that Ohio State was an elite team. Oregon is number 1 because they beat Ohio State by 1 at home. Penn State is number 4 because they barely lost to Ohio State in a game that really wasn't that close. Indiana is still in the playoff rankings because Ohio State beat them and they got beat by one of the elite teams in the country, no matter how bad it was. Then Michigan just went into the horseshoe and beat them down. That game was very synonymous, very synonymous to Ole Miss losing to Kentucky. Because Kentucky and Northwestern, it'd be about the same. Kentucky and Michigan, that'd be about the same. If you want to look at the way the conferences stack up, there's no Maryland, there's no Rutgers necessarily to where you can have the 3-week stretch of gimmies in the Southeastern Conference. I know the narrative around everything. The SEC has died. Look at these regular season records. And Danny Cannell looks like Randy Marsh from South Park, but that isn't the case. But we'll see exactly how that goes for the Ole Miss Rebels. You know, the biggest worry for Ole Miss fans, it isn't on the field. It's the beauty contest off of it. With Miami and Alabama in the mix, can the Rebels outshine two teams that, I don't know, had that nice blue blood smell to their program? Just ask Florida State how costly that beauty contest could be against Alabama. Coming up, why the playoff committee's judgment could be fatal for Ole Miss. You know, get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The SEC championship game is this weekend. And yes, FanDuel did not learn their lesson from last time, and they installed Texas a 2.5-point favorite in that game. Great. Make Kirby an underdog in the state of Georgia and see how that turns out. The FanDuel Sportsbook gives you everything you need to place those live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. And I'm serious about this. Ole Miss is in a beauty contest right now. If you look at metrics and all the stuff that happens, Ole Miss, out of those 4 teams, should probably be the #1 of those 4 teams. They should be over Alabama, South Carolina, and Miami right now. All of the metrics show that. The big wins show that. Everything is in the position to where Ole Miss should have the advantage. Now, unlike everything else, and this is the wiggle room that the committee has, there's always a statistic you can point to and something you can point to justify your decision. And if that decision is to keep Ole Miss out of the playoffs, which it looks like it likely is, and to get Alabama into the playoff, you can find that statistics. That's one of the things that I abhor analytics over, is you can make the numbers say whatever you want them to say. However you want to do it, you can make that happen. So the question that we're going to have is, Ole Miss put itself into a position to where the whims of a group is going to have the final say on this. You know, because Ole Miss is an absolute better choice than Alabama or South Carolina in the playoffs. And Ole Miss has lost their playoff dreams if it happens on a Hugh Freeze double pass, because that is kind of hilarious. And we'll talk about that in just a second. If Bama gets in, Ole Miss lost out on the logo and not the actual performance on the field like Florida State last year. It's one of those situations, tie goes to Bama just about always. But the crazy thing is, the biggest upset that Ole Miss needed for their playoff lives were the Auburn Tigers to beat the Alabama Crimson Tide. And that was an absolutely terrible game by the Auburn Tigers. They just did not look good. And sometime in the third quarter, I think it was the third quarter, Alabama was up 28-14, which was eventually the final score of the game. Auburn gets a big turnover to the point where they get the ball set up on Alabama's 30-yard line. And Hugh Freeze immediately does the Laquan Treadwell double pass that we all know and love. Anybody that's watched any Ole Miss football over the last decade and a half understands exactly what that pass looked like and exactly how it happened. The wide receiver or whoever threw the ball threw it into triple coverage. It got easily picked off, and that was essentially the ball game for the Auburn Tigers. And the game that Ole Miss needed, because Ole Miss needed to take Alabama out of the beauty contest. A popularity contest, a beauty contest, Alabama is going to win that every time because I do not think Alabama has a better football team than Ole Miss this year. I don't think Alabama fans think they have a better football team than Ole Miss this year. They went up to Oklahoma and just got embarrassed by a team that LSU just embarrassed, and they embarrassed LSU, which means you can't play transitive property. It's not real. So it has to be like real metrics of the way it looks, and they don't look right. They have Jalen Milroe playing the role of an athlete as quarterback, trying to sneak into the playoffs to play an Ohio State team that is going to roll them potentially. Penn State's going to roll them because honestly, I don't think they're very good. Now, they did get to face Drew Pine and the Missouri Tigers in a game that they won 34-0. And that looks very good on the resume when you see that Alabama beat Missouri 34-0. When you dig into it for any significant period of time, you see what happened. They barely beat South Carolina. Ole Miss beat them by 4 touchdowns. They barely beat Georgia at home. Ole Miss beat them by 4 scores or 3 scores. Ole Miss won by 18 points in that game. That's a big win. They lost to Oklahoma. Ole Miss lost to Kentucky. They lost to Vandy. Ole Miss lost to Florida. The resumes are remarkably similar. They just are. And Ole Miss probably has the better team in this game, if it should be played. But, hey, everybody says the SEC is the king of hypothetical football. It's because our metrics are so good. And in this hypothetical football game where Alabama needed to run the ball against Ole Miss, they would struggle. And Ole Miss has the athletes to get after the quarterback to kind of make Jalen Milroe's life miserable. It wouldn't be like Ole Miss dominated Lenore Sellers before he got right. That was kind of the last game to where whenever Ole Miss went up to South Carolina, Suntarine Perkins got SEC Player of the Week because he had like 2.5 sacks and just was an absolute holy terror. Ole Miss played that game without Princely Amon-Mielen. Ole Miss played the LSU game without Princely Amon-Mielen. You want to tell me that LSU game would have ended up the same way if Princely Amon-Mielen played in that game? Trey Harris got hurt in that game. Trey Harris was hurt against South Carolina. Trey Harris got hurt in the Florida game. So don't tell me and talk about injuries and things like that because it happens to everyone. Absolutely everyone. But the problem that Ole Miss fans are going to have to deal with is that the committee is going to be biased towards Miami and Alabama and try to get them into the program any way they can, especially over Ole Miss and honestly over South Carolina, which, South Carolina lost to Ole Miss and Alabama. They shouldn't be in the playoffs. They needed Ole Miss to lose again. They needed Alabama to lose again. And they definitely didn't want it to be a head-to-head matchup with Ole Miss. South Carolina had a great close to the end of the season, but they don't have the cachet, I think, to jump over it as well. But this is a committee. This is the committee. I know I'm all over the place thinking about it, and I'm kind of a stream of consciousness talking about what's going on. But this committee is so unpredictable. Who knows exactly how it will shake out when it's finally done? Who knows? Yeah, I don't want to say it feels corrupt, but I think this whole situation would be a whole lot better if it was just BCS rankings and you were trying to get into the top 12 or whatever in those BCS rankings. I know these made for TV ranking shows, which we're going to live react to Tuesday night as well. We'll see how it goes. But it's a game that's a popularity contest with Bama. You're not likely to win that. No, it is what it is. Ole Miss should be over that group of 4. They're a better team than those other 4 football teams. The results on the field honestly shows that. Everything that's happened, margin of victory, the whole 9 yards, beating Georgia by 18 and Carolina by 24, the whole 9 yards. You have a situation to where Ole Miss should be at the top of that 4-team group. I do not think the committee is going to do that because the same reason that Florida State didn't make the playoff last year, and that is Alabama was right below them. And any excuse to get Alabama into the playoff, they're going to take, period. So we'll see exactly how it goes when the rankings come out on Tuesday. In our final segment, we break down the championship week lines with Ole Miss fans rooting hard for Georgia. Can the Bulldogs dominate and keep the Rebels' hope alive? I don't know. Stick around for all the odds and analysis. You know, there's nothing like the energy of being at a live game, the roar of the crowd, the sound of the sneakers squeaking on the court, and even spotting a few celebrities in the stands. I remember going to an NBA game a few years back. I think it was Dallas Mavericks were playing in that game against the Minnesota Timberwolves, and the electricity in that arena was unforgettable. You can't replicate that watching on your couch. This year, I'm looking forward to catching a few more games live, maybe going over and checking the Orlando Magic out. It makes it easier than ever with their new Game Time Picks feature. Whether it's basketball, concerts, or theater, Game Time helps you find the best deals on great seats without the hassle of endless scrolling. I just hopped on the app to check out the tickets for an upcoming game, and the Game Time Picks made it a breeze to find that super deal with amazing seats. Plus, the app showed me a panoramic seat view so I could pick out the perfect spot. No guesswork, no surprises. It's not just sports. Game Time also has incredible deals for concerts and comedy shows. I'm planning to grab some tickets to a concert next month, and with all-in prices, I see exactly what I pay up front. No hidden fees at checkout. What I love the most about Game Time is their lowest price guarantee. If you find a better deal, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. And with the event cancellation protection, your tickets are covered if plans change. It is the most flexible ticketing app I've ever used. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app and create an account and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Again, that's code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. All right, so let's talk about the picks for this week. This is going to be an interesting championship week. The lines are honestly pretty low. It's pretty cool to see a little bit. These are the championship games this weekend. Tulane is starting out favored by 4.5 points versus the Army Black Knights. This is a game, honestly, that Tulane might have a chance to really take off and win. But the question becomes, after Tulane lost their opportunity to potentially sneak into the playoffs, how will Tulane react in a championship game against Army? I think pretty well, because it is the American Championship, but Tulane is a 4.5 point favorite currently. UNLV is at versus Boise State. Boise State's a 4.5 point favorite with Ashton Jeanty, with the playoffs lining up if they win this game. Jeanty is likely to end up breaking Barry Sanders' single season rushing mark if he plays, because you have this game where he's going to run for 150 to 200 yards. And then in the first round of the playoffs, he's probably going to run for 150 to 200 yards, because that's what he does. If he does that, he's liable to break the record. And I don't care if he has 14 games to do it and Barry Sanders had 11. It's still impressive when you run for over 2,600 yards in the season. So, but Boise State is a 4.5 point favorite in that game. Western Kentucky versus Jacksonville State. Jacksonville State is favored by 2.5 points. Rich Rodriguez, Western Kentucky. Really interesting. I do not know too much about those two teams. Should be good. I'm looking forward to Friday and Saturday watching all of the championship games. Ohio is at Miami of Ohio in Oxford, Ohio. And Miami of Ohio is favored by 1.5 points. I think the quarterback for Miami of Ohio is our old friend Connor Bazelak, the former Missouri quarterback. Miami of Ohio put a little bit of a scare in Penn State earlier in the year. I do not know much about Ohio. Iowa State is versus Arizona State. Arizona State's favored by 2.5 points in this game. Arizona State's story this year is actually pretty good. And if Ole Miss does not make the playoffs, Arizona State, I'm going to be rooting for them pretty much the whole time that they're in it. I love their running game. I love how they play. I love that they have like a 30-year-old coach in Kenny Dillingham, and winning 10 games in a season and claiming the Territorial Cup, which, by the way, that is one of my favorite rivalries because both teams started playing each other before the state became a state. And that's kind of cool to me. But Arizona State's favored by 2.5 points in that game. Another game is Clemson versus Southern Methodist, SMU. SMU is favored by 2.5 points. This is a situation we'll have to see where Clemson drops, but one of these two teams is likely going to make the playoffs regardless. It'll be nice if the playoff committee gets Miami out of the peloton, but Clemson is an underdog by 2.5 points to the Southern Methodist, the Mustangs. Who would have thought that Southern Methodist would have been really good in this NIL environment? Who would have saw that coming? Penn State is playing Oregon. Oregon's a 3.5-point favorite against the Nittany Lions. You got James Franklin playing the number one team in the country, and it would be absolutely hilarious if Penn State was able to pull off this game. Because with Ohio State losing the way they did to Michigan, that changes the narrative of the entire conference. There's no way to get around that. You just change the narrative of the entire conference. The whole thing is based off of Oregon having an elite win against Ohio State, Penn State having an elite loss against Ohio State, Indiana having an elite loss against Ohio State. And what if Ohio State is just very good? And the strength of schedule and all of that argument is a real thing. We'll see when Oregon plays Penn State if it's a big football game. If Oregon really blows out Penn State like is possible in these big type games with James Franklin, it'll be interesting. And the last game on rivalry weekend, Texas is a 2.5-point favorite against the Georgia Bulldogs. You would think that FanDuel and the betting lines would learn not to make Georgia an underdog in a football game. This game is going to be in the state of Georgia. Texas is really going to show up. I have no doubts about that. Georgia in the second half of the game kind of looked like they started to turn a corner. And they became Georgia defensively at the end of that game in an overtime that I can remember them being in recent years. It'll be interesting to see how they handle it. Quinn Ewers has a week later with the ankle brace on. His mobility is questionable. So that Georgia game that gave that Texas offensive line problems in the first game, this is going to be a great championship game. I'm very much looking forward to that. Anyway, thanks to everybody. Locked On Ole Miss went over 250,000 views in the month of November, actually over 260,000 this month. So thank you very much for that. We've had a great ride this month, and we're going to move on tonight to Brian Smith and start talking recruiting. Mike Huseman, we're going to start hitting him up on Transfer Portal. He does Transfer Portal with Mike Farrell Sports. He comes on Tuesday night. We will have that as well, and we will just kind of see what happens and how this develops over the course of the near future, and especially the month of December. Signing day is on Wednesday, 2 days away. Caleb Cunningham, we'll see exactly if his name ends up on the dotted line, so to speak, and everything. And this Ole Miss class has a chance to be very special indeed. So we'll see how it looks for Ole Miss. Thank you for making Locked On Ole Miss your go-to source for Ole Miss sports. We pride ourselves on offering the most comprehensive perspectives, which is why we're the number one Ole Miss podcast out there. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen today. For your second listen, check out Locked On SEC podcast. Host Chris Gordy holds no punches, covering the best conference in college football. Find Locked On SEC on YouTube or wherever you listen to those podcasts. And exciting news, you can now become a Locked On Ole Miss Insider. It is the best and easiest way to stay updated on all things Ole Miss sports. It is our texting program that sends you notifications on everything relevant without the hassle of message boards filled with trolls. Enjoy a 14-day free trial and experience the future of college sports coverage. We're adding new perks as we go, so do not miss out. The link is down in the description. For those of you watching on YouTube, we will send you to Locked On College Sports right now. Howdy toddy, everyone.